Greetings. My name is Meaghan Emery, and I'm an associate professor of French at the University of Vermont, and I welcome you to what has been for me a long-awaited event, a forum on Albert Camus. Originally, I had planned to hold this as a live, in-person event a year ago on the University of Vermont campus here in Burlington. But then the pandemic abruptly put a hold on my plans and on all of our plans. Thanks to my guests and to UVM's Humanities Center and co-director Louis Vivanco and staff person Andy Tagliamonte, in addition to the staff who work in the Department of Romance Languages and Cultures, Tilza Bushner, Ruben Goldberg, and Jennifer Baldwin, and at University Event Services, Maureen Cartier, Patty Reagan, and Justin Sell, and finally Beth Wilkins in our IT department, I am able to bring this to a much bigger audience today. The powers of teamwork and technology. 2020 was the 60th anniversary of Albert Camus' death, and it is also the publication year for books by my colleagues, Major Jackson and Robert Zaretsky, and myself, and I've put those titles in the chat. Major Jackson's book of poetry, The Absurd Man, came out through Norton shortly after my book, The Algerian War Retold, of Camus' revolt and post-war reconciliation, published by Routledge. And Robert Zaretsky, whom I had the honor of inviting as an alum of UVM, was also putting finishing touches on his book, published by the University of Chicago Press, The Subversive Simone Weil, a contemporary of Camus, who was an avid reader of her works. So it was intended to be a book launch and a homecoming of sorts, and we were clearly upstaged by another actor, namely the COVID-19 virus, who appeared, to those of us who had read The Plague at least, to be reading from a script. This novel, written by Camus, was a bestseller when it came out in 1947 and found itself again at the top of the bestseller lists in 2020, far surpassing ours. Major and Rob, I'm very glad that you are able to join me today. Things have changed a lot since last year. We have all continued our work, which has branched off in other directions, but Camus is still very much with us. For myself, shortly after news came of George Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020, I was invited by Laura Mason of Johns Hopkins University to contribute an essay about the plague for a pandemic issue of Fiction and Film for Scholars of France, and I put that link in the chat as well. It's titled To Watch Someone Die. Having just reread the novel with my advanced level class at UVM, and then seeing what was happening in American cities following the death of George Floyd and the burgeoning Black Lives Matter movement embraced by so many Americans of every color and creed, I felt compelled to dig more deeply into one particular viewpoint on the novel, which I had included in my book and belonged to Algerian writer Mouloud Faharoun. In a 1951 letter to his friend Camus, he wrote that he had, quote, understood the Plague, Camus' novel, like he had never understood any other. This is a phrase that has stuck with me. Sadly, like many Algerians, Faharoun was killed in Algeria. He was killed in Algiers by a military crackdown at the hands of the OAS, the secret army of French generals opposed to Algerian independence in March of 1962. Faharoun had known the plague, that is racism, subjugating living, breathing, thinking, loving, and beloved human beings to inequality and to a life marked by injustice and bodily injury, people who did not look like those in power, in this case, the French colonial government, its justice system, and all the systems that established the French Republic as a seemingly invincible master. France's invincibility was not to last, as it turned out, and tellingly for political reasons, more than military. As much as Camus is known for his deep and fearless engagement in the struggles of his time, colonialism, communism, Nazism, nuclear war, and totalitarianisms of all kinds, the Plague, written in France, a country of exile for Camus, had spoken directly to his fellow Algerians' experience as an Arab. And that takes us to today, to the reason why I invited my good friend Major and my new friend Rob, although he seems like an old friend since I've been reading his books for years. Plague and What It Means is the subject of today. Historian Robert Zaretsky will enlighten us on why plagues demand our attention. And poet Major Jackson will do so as well with his poetry, both speaking from their American experience. Just a quick rundown of the schedule, which I've also put in the chat. After this introduction, Robert Zaretsky will begin his talk, which is titled Why Plagues Demand Our Attention, and he will be followed by Major Jackson, who will be giving his poetry reading. And then we will have a roundtable discussion, and I will be leading that discussion. Then there will be an audience Q&A led by my colleague, Charles-Louis Morand-Métivier, and then finally we will close. Following Rob's talk and Major's poetry reading, we will be able to have your questions, and so I invite you during this entire forum to put those questions into the Q&A so that Charles-Louis can collect them and prepare them for that Q&A. Let me introduce my colleagues. Major Jackson is now the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently, The Absurd Man, whose title was inspired by his reading of Camus' philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Jackson's powerful poetry interweaves among its threads themes and images that one finds in this essay and in others of Camus' essays contained in Resistance, Rebellion, and Death. A recipient of fellowships from Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, Major Jackson's poems and essays have been published in American Poetry Review, The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Plowshares, and The New York Times. He serves as a poetry editor of the Harvard Review. And Robert Zaretsky is a professor of history in the Honors College at the University of Houston. His books include Albert Camus, Elements of a Life Worth Living, Albert Camus and the Quest for Meaning, Boswell's Enlightenment, Catherine and Diderot, The Empress, the Philosopher, and the Fate of the Enlightenment, and The Subversive Simone Weil. His new manuscript, based on his volunteer work at a nursing home during the pandemic with readings of 6 writers who also dealt with plagues, including Thucydides, Marcus Aurelius, Michel de Montaigne, Daniel Defoe, Mary Shelley, and Albert Camus, will also be published by the University of Chicago Press. And now it is up to Rob. I let him lead our discussion here.
Thanks, Meaghan. And my thanks to all of you for being here and taking the time to join us in this forum. I really do need to thank Meaghan for making this happen. It's been a long time. She's been so patient and persistent, and so I'm extremely grateful that we're finally here together, and this is all due to her hard work. There's somebody else I need to thank, somebody else at the University of Vermont, Professor Patrick Hutton. I think Pat may be out there somewhere, I'm not certain. When I arrived at UVM in the early 1980s to do my master's in history, I planned on doing the master's in American history, but the department, for reasons I don't quite understand, assigned me a French historian as my advisor, and that French historian was Pat Hutton. And it was one of those accidents of history for which I will always be grateful. Pat is a remarkable historian, a remarkable teacher, and a remarkable mentor. His work has influenced not just generations of scholars, but also, and I saw this at firsthand, generations of students like myself. And it's because of my experience at UVM, my experience with Pat and others at the Department of History, that I was stunned by the news that the president at UVM and the board are slashing the humanities. Now, their rationale seems to be that they've seen the future, a future dominated by STEM, and they think that this future works. And the question I would like to simply pose is, can this really be true? What Pat taught his students was that historians, like scientists, seek out facts. They search for truths. They also are obliged to study and to master subject matter that is just wondrously complex and intricate, and then share that knowledge with others. Now, the complexity of the past and how it shapes the present is a question worth thinking about. And I think it's a question worth thinking about not only in the classroom, but also in the boardroom. I don't believe Santayana was right to think that those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. But I do believe that those who don't learn about the past are condemned to retreat into shallower and thinner lives. And I just can't help but share these thoughts with you in the wake of this recent news. Now, having said that, let me turn to my shallow and thin talk on Albert Camus. Albert Camus often did things by fives. In The Stranger, Meursault, the protagonist, shoots the Arab 5 times. In his play, The Just Assassins, there are 5 acts, just as there are in French tragedy, classical French tragedy. In his philosophical essay, The Rebel, there are 5 sections. For Camus, tragedy and all of the works I've just named are tragic to one degree or another. Tragedy is divisible by 5. Now, the most tragic of all of these works, The Plague, also has 5 sections. It was a novel that Camus began after France's fall and its occupation by Nazi Germany. It was during the publication of 2 works from his first cycle, the cycle of the absurd, namely The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, that he began to truly research and write. And this was undertaken after he left his native Algeria for southeastern France, for a hamlet by the name of Le Penelier, which is located on the southeastern edge of the Massif Central. He left in the summer of 1942 because he discovered that his tuberculosis had worsened. It had spread to his other and previously clean lung. And it was in Le Penelier that same year in November that he found himself trapped when in November the Germans invaded what was until then known as the Free Zone and was under the control of the collaborationist regime of Vichy. Now, a similar trap is sprung at the start of the plague. We find ourselves in Oran, the second largest city in Algeria, sometime in the 1940s. He doesn't specify when. And suddenly the plague strikes and the city is occupied by this pestilence. And occupied by the pestilence, the city is shut down. It's closed off to the rest of the world. And we meet one by one the principal characters in this tragedy. They number 5 as well. There's Bernard Rieu, Jean Tarrou, Joseph Grand, Raymond Rambert, Father Panelou, and Cotard. Now, we later learn that Rieu, who's a doctor, is the author of the story. But is it une histoire which of course in French can mean either story or history, or is it something else altogether? Rieu doesn't help matters. He doesn't really clarify where we stand. At times he describes himself as a historian. At times he describes his account not as a history, but instead as a chronique, a chronicle. Now, the choice of words, I think, reflects a choice of narrative values. Histoire, a history, implies the presence of an author who's shaping the material. A chronique, on the other hand, suggests the absence of this kind of authorial control. There is no author in principle. In the latter, in a chronique, unlike a history, events seem to impose themselves without a chronicler, without the chronicler establishing a moral or causal connection between these events. Now, Rieu makes this distinction not just at the start of his story, but also in the middle and at the end of the story. And each time he repeats his criteria for telling the story pas comme les autres. He reminds us that he is describing only those events he had witnessed, he had heard about from others, or documents that he found. He reminds us that he aims at objectivity. He reminds us that he did not make any changes for artistic effect. And so in this histoire qui n'est pas une histoire, he also reminds us that he, and I quote, refrained from attributing thoughts to his fellow sufferers that when all is said and done, they were not bound to have. Now with this, Rieu also reminds us that he has read Thucydides. Thucydides, who in his history presents the same criteria for writing it, including his confounding claim that he has his historical actors say those things they should have said, even if they didn't. And so, as with Thucydides, so too with Camus and Rieu, by claiming objectivity, what I think they're doing is asking us, urging us, to make our own moral and causal connections. And so we have to be attentive when we read these works. Now, for Rieu, there's a vital connection between morality and language. To express oneself clearly, to express oneself truthfully, is, quite simply, a moral duty. When Rambert, who's a journalist from Paris, sent to Algeria to write on the condition of the Arab and Berber communities, when he asks Rieu if he can interview him on the subject, Rieu, who is all too familiar with the wretched conditions of these peoples, asks Rambert if he will publish everything that Rieu tells him. Rambert says that he can't make that kind of promise. And as a result, Rieu refuses to be interviewed. He tells Rambert that he has no patience with, quote, injustice and compromises with the truth. Now, this is also the case with the plague. Rieu writes that he is, and I quote, that he is resolved to, and here I quote, to fix his mind on observed facts, to lucidly recognize what had to be recognized, to do his job as it should be done, even or especially when that job, whether it's diagnosing a bacterial pestilence or an ideological pestilence, that all of these demand facts and focus. in the journal that he was keeping at the time, he asked himself a question. I quote, "What is the ideal for man prey to plague?" And then he gives the answer. He writes, "Others will laugh at it, but the answer is honesty." Now, this same ethical imperative holds for his comrades. Joseph Grand, for example, is an obscure government clerk who devotes his free time trying to write. He has striven for years without any success at all to find the words to, and I quote, "to render perfectly the picture in my mind's eye so that from the very first words, it will be possible to say, chapeau, hats off." As for Jean Tarrou, he is forever scarred by his youthful experience of witnessing his father, who was a prosecutor, condemn a man to death. His father, Tarrou recalled, quote, "spewed out long, turgid phrases," end of quote, "that hid the act's enormity. And he substituted abstractions like the supreme penalty for the reality of separating a man's head from the rest of his body." And ever since this experience, Tarrou came to understand that, and again I quote, "all our troubles spring from our failure to use plain, clean-cut language." In one of his sermons, even Father Panelou, who's a very erudite Jesuit, refuses, again I quote, "an eloquence that, considering the tragic nature of the occasion, would be out of keeping." Of these five, only Cottard, who's refused a first name, by the way, by the narrator, Rieu, also refuses to tell the truth about his very dubious past. And at one point, he remarks ominously that he wishes he too were a writer, but not in order to tell the truth, not in order to educate others, but instead in order to control others. Now, as the actions of Rieu, Tarrou, and company make clear, there's a common thread for all of them between seeing, speaking, and acting rightly. And it's a thread that binds them so closely together that it's difficult to distinguish them one from the other. Once the city is quarantined, all of these individuals gravitate towards Rieu, and they thicken into a kind of resistance. A stranger to Oran, Tarrou pays a visit to Rieu in order to propose the creation of voluntary sanitation squads. And this in turn allows Rieu, who agrees immediately to this proposal, to explain why he agreed. Quote, "I've never managed to get used to seeing people die." And when Tarrou remarks that the doctor's successes in this effort will always and necessarily be temporary, Rieu replies that he knows these efforts lead to, quote, "never-ending defeat." But this doesn't stop him, it doesn't stop the others. When Rambert finds himself trapped in Oran, he pleads with Rieu to provide him with a pass to leave the city and return to Paris, where his fiancée lives. When Rieu tells him that he can't do that, Rambert explodes. He shouts, "I don't belong here." And Rieu simply replies, "From this point, you will belong here." Rejecting this diagnosis, Rambert then pursues every possible avenue, and of course they're all illegal, in order to escape Oran. Several weeks later, he finally has his chance, and he does not take it. He turns it down and instead casts his lot with those who are resisting the plague. And he gives his reason, quote, "Now that I've seen what I've seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want to or not." Now, for those who do resist the plague, morality in a way begins and ends with the act of seeing clearly, what Simone Weil calls attention, a notion that deeply impressed Camus. Tarrou echoes this insight when he recounts his courtroom experience. He turns away from his father, who was just going on and on about the monstrous character of this criminal, this man who's been charged. And the young Tarrou then turns towards the criminal himself. And he tells Rieu, and I quote, "He looked like a yellow owl, scared blind by too much light. His tie was slightly awry. He kept biting his nails, those of one hand only, his right. I needn't go on. Do I? You've understood. He was a living human being," end of quote. Dwelling on a detail, the man was biting the nails of one hand. Tarrou then pays closer attention. It's the right hand. And this detail makes clear that unlike his father, or for that matter, just about all of us, Tarrou saw that man with those bitten nails on this right hand. The same nails that would still grow, if only for a short while, after his head has been severed from his body. Now, Tarrou, Rieu, Rambert all find the words, written or spoken, to convey the moral imperative of seeing the world as it is. But for Joseph Grand, matters are less straightforward. He struggles to find his words. And Rieu tells us that this struggle is really the key to his personality. Grand cannot find the words to explain to his employer, his manager, why he should be making more money, money that he had been promised. Grand cannot find the words to explain to his unhappy wife who left him years earlier why he was the way he was. And he cannot find the words to complete the first paragraph to the novel he's been trying to write for years. As Grand sort of explodes to a bemused Rieu, "Oh, doctor, how I'd like to learn to express myself." And yet, when he's invited by Rieu to join the sanitation team, Grand says yes, and we're told by Rieu, without a moment's hesitation. Now, this absence of hesitation seems to me crucial. Although Grand lacked the words to convey what he saw, the clarity of his vision led to the alacrity of his action. It's as if seeing and acting occur simultaneously for Joseph Grand. That when somebody like Grand confronts a situation that requires a moral choice, he acts because that choice has already been made. Now, this moral quality of sight has been underscored by the philosopher and the novelist Iris Murdoch, somebody I might add who was deeply influenced not just by Simone Weil, but also by Albert Camus. And in one of her philosophical essays, The Sovereignty of Good, Murdoch writes that it is a task, and she italicizes task, it is a task to come to see the world as it is. And the reason it's so hard to see rightly, she continues, is because, she writes, our fat, relentless ego always blocks our sight. The difficulty, she goes on, is to keep the attention fixed upon the real situation and to prevent it from returning surreptitiously to the self with consolations of self-pity, resentment, fantasy, or despair. Now, this is the same task at which all of the novel's characters struggle. They all wrestle with this. The temptation of self-pity and the temptation of resentment blind Rambert when he tries to escape Oran and return to Paris. The longing for fantasy blind the city's administrators when they, at least at first, refuse to call the plague by its name. Indeed, even Rieux hesitates, if only for a moment as well, to name the plague until he's prodded to do so by one of his colleagues. But this is not the case with Joseph Grand, whose behavior Rieux struggles to diagnose. Rieux tells us that he does not want to exaggerate the actions of volunteers like Grand. He doesn't want to exaggerate it by calling it courageous or heroic. Doing what they had to do, people like Grand are to be congratulated no more, he writes, than a teacher on teaching that 2 and 2 make 4. Of course, there will always be times, now as then, that doing what one has to do, on declaring that 2 and 2, in fact, make 4, can be dangerous and, in fact, can be deadly. But this does not alter, Rieux tells us, knowing whether 2 and 2 make 4. Now, upon acknowledging, in fact, upon seeing this simple truth, everything else follows for Joseph Grand. Or perhaps more accurately, everything unfolds at the same time. It's not so much seeing as believing. Forget that. That's not the case with Joseph Grand. Instead, it's seeing as doing. Now, much has been made, including by me, in the books and the articles I've written on Camus, of the fact that while Camus was living at Le Penelier, he was almost literally a stone's throw from a town down the road by the name of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. Now, as many of you probably know, must know, Chambon is the Protestant village that during the Second World War rescued the lives of thousands of Jewish children, refugee Jewish children, as well as adults. Now, what Camus knew about these activities and what he himself did during his stay at Le Penelier is complicated. But what I can say with certainty is that he took no part in the resistance activities in Chambon. Instead, his time was mostly devoted to reading scientific literature on plagues and diseases, on literature on plagues and diseases. He read his Thucydides, he read his Faux, he was reading Michel de Montaigne. And he was writing his early drafts to the novel. It was only in late 1943, after having moved to Paris, that Camus, in fact, joins the resistance movement combat. But the brutal reality of the occupation, seeing what he saw, made Camus rethink the very notion of absurdity, the absurd, that he had devoted so much attention to in his first three works, Caligula, The Stranger, and The Myth of Sisyphus. And he thought he had to think again. Now, thinking is really hard. Rethinking is so very hard. And Camus is thinking about how hard it is. In his journal that he's keeping at the time, he writes, and I quote, "Let's suppose a philosopher who, after having published several works, declares in a new book, up to now, I was going in the wrong direction. I am going to begin all over. I think now I was wrong." If the philosopher did that, Camus continues, no one would take him seriously anymore. And yet, Camus concludes, he would then be giving proof that he is worthy of thought. Now, several characters in the novel prove themselves worthy of thought. Rambert finally decides his place in Oran. Tarrou finally accepts that he too carries the pestilence. Even Panelou, after attending this awful death of a young boy who was given an experimental serum, Panelou finally rethinks his faith. The odd man out is Grand. This clerk seems so insignificant, but as Camus observed in a later essay, insignificance is not the same as meaninglessness. In fact, I think that Grand is the most significant character in the novel. Unlike the others, he always already knew what to do, what had to be done. All he needed was the opportunity, the invitation, really, to act upon it. When Rieu asks if he would join the sanitation team, as I mentioned, Grand joins without hesitation. And when Rieu just sort of embarrasses him with his gratitude, Grand replies, and I quote, "Why, that's not difficult. Plague is here and we've got to make a stand. That's obvious. I only wish everything were as simple." End of quote. Now, Murdoch, as I mentioned, admired Camus' work, and she cites his novels as examples of how literature, unlike philosophy, helps us, and I quote, "to rediscover a sense of the density of our lives, and it arms us against consolation and fantasy." End of quote. To do this, she adds, prose must recover its former eloquence. And this is an eloquence that she connects with the effort to, quote, "speak the truth," an effort that makes her think, and I quote, of the works of Albert Camus, end of quote. Now, I wonder if Murdoch, while she read The Plague, connected Joseph Grand to this ravishing insight of hers, into the activity of seeing and doing, and how deeply they're related. And so let me finish with a quote from Iris Murdoch. "If we consider what the work of attention is like, how continuously it goes on, and how imperceptibly it builds up structures of value around us, we shall not be surprised that at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over." Now, as Grand would have said, chapeau, hats off. Now, what I had planned on doing was moving from hats off to masks on. But I've run out of time. I'm over time, in fact. So what I'd like to do is turn the forum back to Meaghan, who will then introduce Major Jackson, and Major will read his poem. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. That was wonderful. So I will not spend any more time. Without further ado, Major Jackson, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Rob. And thank you, Meaghan. This is dizzyingly exciting for me to be a part of this forum on Camus. I latched on to that phrase, the moral imperative of seeing the world as it is, and I think that might be some of the subtext of our conversation today. Meaghan, what turned out to be a coincidence, the Algerian War foretold, and the publication of The Absurd Man and Robert's book is clearly a boon at this moment. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about Camus, at least my tenuous, long relationship to his writings, which has wavered over the years. I'm going to preface my reading with something that I wrote this morning that hopefully might lend itself to a larger essay that I've been holding off on writing. Everyone knows poetry is not literary criticism, but we are inspired and have these conversations across decades and centuries with the poets who kind of animate and activate our imagination and creativity. Over the years, my poetry has vacillated between exploring a deeply personal set of symbols, dreams, memories, cultural codes, language, and aesthetic passions on one hand, and on the other, addressing, because of the significance of my platform, injustices and other causes whose aim is to diminish the least wise among us. When an event occurs like what happened last week in Atlanta, the explicit violence against members of the Asian American community, like some who are driven to take to the streets or social media, I'm driven to my computer or journals. I'm off to pursue the metaphors that can embody whatever truths are to be found there, or to battle what I know will surely come easy formulations, which is to say, for example, to say sexual addiction drives a man to kill comes with a ready-made narrative that is meant to obscure the complexity of, in this instance, Asian American anti-Asian racism in our society. The choice of what to write suggests on the surface, as Albert Camus points out in a lecture he gave 4 days after his Nobel acceptance, that I exercise as a poet a divine liberty and freedom. But he goes on to say, the times that we live prevent us from wholly ignoring the cries in the streets for equity and justice, for our very lives are implicated by the social and political context out of which we write, which might render, in the end, our works as mere entertainment. The artist is besieged on all sides to speak truth to power, and if one does not, then they may be judged irrelevant, likely not to garner a review or prize or critical attention. And if that artist is perceived as a member of a marginalized community, this will doubly be the case. It is an erasure that is not new. However, to be awakened to the issues that are most pressing is also to face the possibility of advancing the art and us toward a greater incarnation of ourselves. In writing the poems that would become my book, The Absurd Man, I borrowed Camus' figure of the person who lives on the dizzying crest, that is integrity, to get at the several facts of being a poet or pursuing this art for as many years as I have. One, driven by a desire to, as Camus says, to give the void its colors. The poet is a kind of absurd hero, for they must repetitively return to the art, fully aware that what truths or observations made will be fleeting, if any epiphany is to arrive at all. And even more, that they are aware that what they write will have little to no impact on the world around them. Poetry makes nothing happen, Auden famously states. And yet poets rise to begin again the search that might yield some crumb of understanding, if meaning, capital M, proves elusive. This is the Sisyphean task, pursued with great relish, if not trepidation, but always with joy. Two, I also find that the noble response to such impenetrability, like Camus, is not to falter in some ideology, but to give space for the illogic. Writing poems help me to do that. Indeterminacy is a logical space for the absurd man. My poetry at once practices and amplifies uncertainty and doubt as a liberating space, once articulated long ago by the British poet John Keats as negative capability. Three, finally, I turn toward the absurd man as a figure to complicate notions of authorship and to dramatize for a reader, a potential reader, the fact that most of the speakers in my poems are constructions who render me, the true me, whatever that is, invisible in the end. Abstracting the self from the self through a voicing about the self, as Jorge Luis Borges models in his piece, Borges and I, was an attractive strategy for me to pursue, in that it reminded me of Camus' reflections on the actor in the myth of Sisyphus, who will die in 3 hours under the mask he has assumed. That is called losing oneself to find oneself. That is to say, I write myself out of the silence with hopes of giving shape to some interior selfhood. I chose the following poems to give some example or some sample of the book, and hope you enjoy the refractions that I feel are dominant themes in Camus' work. This first poem is titled The Flag of Imagination Furled, and you'll hear a very popular quotable phrase that is included in one of Camus' essays. I think it's The Return to Timpasa. In the middle of March, the sky over Siena faded like a roar, but not the tenants of cemeteries. For I had not learned to wrestle the hours, nor solve the great riddles in the narrow districts of my glass-encased cities. What overcame me? All that running my forefinger down the wintry pages of my masters and my adversaries, touching their sentences like sculptured palaces, touring their villages of ink. I'm sure Nina Simone was there and helped to deepen the pouches beneath my eyes, even in gleeful Madrid. Even as I preached to a cloistered community, close-knit as a garlic clove, or spray-painted morning fog, avoiding the lash of geraniums lest it launch me into a spell of lyric wonder. Severe sadness, a cocoon of oppression. Nothing accounted for my frozen laughter in the proud cantinas. My meticulous lack of holy clamor as I scribbled toward some infinitude. How often I wanted to cruise my mirrors or pose questions to my footsteps. Of course, without the crisis of caves or politicians eating hungrily from their dark bowls of pocket watches. There is within me an invincible summer, a seasonal wind, and my name is on it. I think that poem is somewhat about influence and engaging in the life of the mind. This is called Double Major, and this is one of the two poems that takes on Borges' challenge of abstracting the self and speaking about the self as a way of understanding the self, if that makes sense. The pun is double major. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings and ordered athenaeums. I own his face, but he washes and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They steer his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know, his dreams are his grandfather's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possessed a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls out thirst for pads and pencils destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, he closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability, the test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves, writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed. To bed. The Camus lecture, as I referenced earlier, Create Dangerously, really activated at a young age my sense of the precarious position that the artist finds himself, and yet also a desire to, well, I should say, to inhabit and possess the freedom to write about nature if he wants, or trees, or beach, and if he so desires to turn his talents towards giving expression to that which oppresses and prevents us from becoming fully realized human beings. That has been an important imperative for me over the past, I would say, decades. It's always been there, but increasingly I find myself turning my pen towards activist causes. This is called Let Me Begin Again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, sifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then, like a raging waterfall, grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the birdcage, or the serrated blade, or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer, I am licking my lips. This poem was written in response to the Unite to Write march in Charlottesville. Unite the right. In the 80s, we did the WAP. If you end your crusades for the great race, then I will end my reenactments of flying. And if you lean down to smell a painted trillium, then I will cast a closer eye on those amber waves. And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn my drums to the sea and away from your wounded mountains. Who mothered your love of death? Here is a heart-shaped stone to rub when you feel fear rising. Give me anything. An empty can of Pabst, a plastic souvenir, a t-shirt from Daytona. Here is the first edition, the complete poems of Lucille Clifton. Give me an ancient grove and a conversation by a creek, charms to solve my griefs. Something that says, you are human, and I will give you the laughter in my brain and the tranquil eyes of my uncles. Show me your grin in the middle of winter. In the 80s, we did the WAP. You too have your dances. It is like stealing light from a flash in the sky. I promise, no one is blaming you. No one is trying to replace you. It's just that you are carrying a tainted clock, calling it European history. Standing in khakis, eyes frightened like a mess of beetles. I'm gonna read two more poems. Think of me laughing. You're right to imagine me sobbing on the corner of 6th Avenue and West 4th, or raising a hashtag cardboard above my head near the Liberty Bell. You are right to picture me lying down below the gold dome Capitol demanding don't shoot. It is my annual day of sobbing. What are these brown hands for, if not to bury my eyes in the ancient rivers of wrongs? And isn't this my consigned single note in our final piece of music, mindless as a blink? So go ahead. You and I are once again rehearsing decency. It is the dream of loving fruited plains that do not love you back. It is our feet planted in concrete that has me weak. But first, give thought to my luxuries. The sunset I toasted over the Val di Schiana with an aperitivo in Cafe Poliziano the summer of 15. Or give thought to the promontories of conversation with my father yesterday, in which, among other delights, we discussed the dignity of eggplants, whose purplish tint reminded him of a great aunt. Consider my love of celestial bodies. You're better off thinking of me singing this morning a little Marvin Gaye, not what's going on, but I want you, sultry and soulful. A one-way love is just a fantasy. Oh, sugar. Forgive me for being bound up in the ecstatic right now. I do not regret my little bout with life. And this is The Absurd Man. Somewhere around here. The absurd man is subject to pareidolia. No one believes in angels. The hills appear lost. The president waves routinely. At dusk, the passing towns gather all their charms and give them to the coming night, the body's coffin. The dashboard's panel is a commercial break from the mind of forest, music burning in the seeds. If not for angels, we'd fall to more wars, I say. And my love waves more than the universe. Don't ask me to explain this. Carbines fall on the trees. Something shows between the branches, taking shape. I know I'll suffer this plague forever. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here with you all. Now, Meaghan's gonna moderate.
Yes. And applause for you too, Major. It's absolutely wonderful to hear your poetry. It's the first time.
Oh.
So, except for online.
Right.
Live. So I'm really thrilled. Because of course cadence and the rhythm that only the poet can give, that is truly true to the poem. Of course, we can all see other things in the poems, and we can give our own rhythms to these poems as well. But I like hearing it in your voice. And so let me start us off here. You know, you and Rob have both given me and our audience a look into your inner selves. You know, Rob worked for 3 months in a nursing home, caring for patients who couldn't feed themselves, seeing firsthand people die alone in their beds without family. And of course, what is poetry if not the vision of the poet, Major? So Major, I'd like to start with you. And you wrote in your 2006 volume, Hoops, in the poem entitled Hunting Park, and I quote, "At 12, I despaired, till I read Le Mythe de Sisyphe, Camus aired, my darkest thoughts and the ghetto luckless, who often pronounced, and excuse my French, I don't give a fuck." Please tell us about your experience of reading The Myth of Sisyphus, which is incredibly precocious for a 12-year-old. What did it open up to you or in you? How did it specifically affect you? And I suppose it's not necessarily hope that you were feeling.
Mm-hmm. Well, 12 is a bit of an exaggeration. When I wrote that poem, 13 and 14 just sounded too loud, and I, believe it or not, I chose 12 because it was a monosyllabic word that fit perfectly. But I will say, by the time I read The Stranger, and I guess, you know, if you're of a certain age in the 80s reading The Stranger, you have to say, like many high school students, it was one of the books that kind of one of the books that kind of animated so much that was going on around me, surprisingly. I was fortunate enough to have a high school curriculum, English curriculum, that included a lot of course, Shakespeare, but also a lot of the mid-20th century classics, Orwell's Animal Farm, Golding's Lord of the Flies, Richard Wright's Native Son, Zora Neale Hurston, Catch-22, Major, heard my name many times over, discussing that book. But it was reading The Stranger that I have to admit was, and I'm not alone saying this, I know, but it was truly an aesthetic experience, and one that I could not, of course, see myself in, but definitely it got me to reading a lot of Camus afterwards. I very much wanted to encounter the lucidness of his prose, the spaciousness, the pacing, the cadence, and definitely by the time I read The Myth of Sisyphus, I latched on to many of the declarations, and that is the book that I have to say where I identified so much of myself. And I'll never forget, it was the moment in which he's cataloging absurd moments before he launches into his discussion of the actor and Don Juan and the Conqueror. And one of the moments he discusses, which was such a seminal moment for me, was looking in the mirror and suddenly looking at a strange figure, or it might have been a picture, but definitely I'm sure it was the mirror. And I was rapt from then on, and I started, that book became my Pavlovian book, the book that if I'm in bookstores, I reach for, even though I knew I had it. Subsequently, I bought all those paperbacks, Justin O'Brien's translations, and I looked, and in one of them, my signature is in there in the year. It would have been 87, around the time that I was listening to The Cure. And so, you know, if you're of a certain generation, Camus spoke to you through his characters and through his philosophy.
Yeah.
And I should say one other thing, why it resonated for me, because there was so much around me that was collapsing. Family structure, my community. I grew up in North Philadelphia. If there was anyone who understood the absurd nature of life and who kind of sought some stability and answers, and as someone who grew up in the church already, Christianity or religion wasn't doing that for me, or that narrative. So The Myth of Sisyphus gave me a pathway to kind of understanding that I wasn't alone in that anxiety or dissatisfaction.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful answer, and it's still precocious. I think I read The Stranger in high school, and I didn't get it until I was in my 40s, I think. So it's a very difficult text. I think yeah, you can see why you became a poet. So I know you don't cite The Plague as one of Camus' texts that influenced your writing, yet you included The Plague in a line of your poetry that you read today. And I still want you to think about, though, about what Rob said. He quoted the journalist Rambert, who's one of the characters, one of the 5 characters in The Plague, and he's on assignment from Paris, eager to escape this plague-stricken city in Algeria. And yet, when he had the chance to finally get out of that city, he couldn't bring himself to do it. And he states, "Now that I've seen what I have seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want to or not." And he joins the resistance. And you talked specifically about being more of an activist in your poetry, in your remarks as you were reading your poetry. So what does that mean to you as a poet? Now that I've seen what I've seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want to or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was maybe Jeff Dyer who discusses how reading Camus from different, either a different class position or suggests this idea of flight. And, you know, Camus, who had his own particular kind of class issues, is probably the thing that alienated him with the intellects of his time. You know, much of my understanding of Camus is owed to where I come from and what I experienced, and a different kind of pandemic that was happening in my neighborhood, particularly regarding drugs. And so, or the onslaught of drugs in Black communities in the 80s. So I think there is so much kind of that's overstressed regarding particularly people from marginalized communities and flight or escape. I think we never really escape. I think the what shapes us always is there, and it's also there for material. So that passage, I don't necessarily connect with, because writing for me has always been both a journey away from and also a return. I talk about in graduate school, my first book, which I had started writing before graduate school, I didn't complete until I left in Philadelphia Central in my younger years in Philadelphia. It didn't happen in Philadelphia, it happened because I got away and was able to have a different relationship to my birth city or origin city. But it's all allegorical. So I will say that what one sees, I want to say I'm not an activist, but, and I reserve the right to kind of stay in my lane as a writer, but when I choose to turn my gaze, as Camus says, the artist finds themselves down there with the gladiator. When I choose to turn and write about what's around me, that is a particular freedom that I am exercising. So it's not necessarily an escape from, but a kind of amplification of purpose, maybe. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. And you touched on many, many points that I wanted to bring up. So let us turn to Rob. Rob, you noted, and I quote, the vital connection between morality and language in Camus' writing. And you go on to cite the following passage in Camus' novel, which is the quote, "Job, whether in diagnosing a bacterial or ideological pestilence, demands real facts and relentless clarity. What is the ideal for a man prey to plague? It is quite simply honesty." End of quote. And this speaks very much to your job, Rob, as an historian. And how has Camus not only informed but guided your work as a scholar?
It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. When I first started reading Camus, it was also in high school, like major, but to be perfectly honest, I would take my brother's copy of Camus, The Stranger, I would take the bus from my town in New Jersey into Greenwich Village every weekend, and I would hang out at cafes. And I would conspicuously hold the copy of The Stranger in front of me, trying to impress women. It never worked. And I pretended to read it. I didn't get very much from it in high school. I wasn't precocious at all. And you know, after reading it many times and teaching it many times, writing about it, I still don't fully get it. It's a remarkably elusive novel. Now, as far as Camus and his impact on my work, well, I don't think a historian can be an activist, just as Major wants to stay in his lane as a writer. I want to stay in my lane as a historian. But I can't help but think about the ways in which the past bleeds into the present. And that it is for us as historians, just as it was for Camus, as a novelist, as a playwright, to not so much tell people, but to show people. And you do that through your history, you do that through your books, you do that through your essays, you do it indirectly. The reasons I've chosen certain subjects to write on is because they help me better make sense of the position, the predicament, the pickle that I find myself in time after time. That was the reason why I took up this new book called Plague Stories. I was working at the nursing home. It was a nursing home where my wife works, and she told me about just how desperate the situation was, how understaffed they were. And so I volunteered, and it was an overwhelming experience, in part because for the first time I truly understood what Julie, my wife, experienced day to day, 10 hours a day at her job. But it was also overwhelming because of the conditions. The home was closed down like Iran, and everybody lived in a state of isolation. The patients could not see their families. Very often they could not see one another. They were limited one to a room at times. They were obliged to wear masks after a while. Many of them were on the spectrum, the Alzheimer's spectrum. Their disorientation increased over time. And so it was for me natural to turn to certain writers that I've read time and again in the past to make sense of this. I turned to the writers that you mentioned, Meaghan. But the most important writer, the person I always go to when I have questions that I can't answer, is Camus. He's really my go-to person. Which is not to say that he wasn't a flawed and perfect human being. He was very much flawed and very much imperfect. But it doesn't get in the way of his writing and what he has always managed to say to me. For example, about paying attention, or for example, thinking and rethinking. And so I'd like to think that this is something that I bring to my writing. But enough about me. What about you and Camus, Meaghan? You talk to us.
Well, I have to agree with you, Rob, that and it's striking. I'm a woman, and Camus, of course, is someone who had relations that could be troublesome, you know, to me as a woman. He enjoyed women very much and hurt women very much, but they all, you know, felt that he was genuine. So that's the subject of my next book, in fact, is women. And it's maybe it's because of writing on Camus for many years. But yes, he provides for me, and I really appreciate this. Is a little off script here, but he provides for me, direction when it comes to the anger that we feel on a regular basis, living in a society, and no matter the color of your skin, we all experience injustice, and we can also, sympathize or empathize with people, just as we saw last spring and summer, experiencing, extreme injustice. I've, of course, never been in a situation where I felt my life was threatened. And he allows me to channel that anger in a way that is constructive, in a way that reminds me about what it means to be human, and also what it means to construct something that is positive in our lives. And it's based on relationships. It's based on, listening and speaking, from this part of yourself that is, I would say that, the core part of yourself. He had an uncanny ability, I think, to speak to human beings, no matter where you're from, no matter your experience. And I've read him exhaustively, and I do go back to him regularly. I thank you for that question. And he talks in his, he writes about, or he spoke about in his talk, after he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, that writing can be more of a chore than a comfortable privilege. And I want to go back to, your experience for both of you, and perhaps dig a little bit more deeply into Major's poems as well. And please, audience members, feel free to type questions into the Q&A. I will stop as soon as I see questions there. And we are allowed to go 10 minutes past our 3:30 time, so don't feel that we're under press here. So let's dig a little bit into Major's, poetry. And I love this poem, Major. In the 80s, we did the WAP. I love it. And it really seems to get at the heart of what Camus is saying regarding duty and freedom. And particularly these lines: "And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn my drums to the sea and away from your wounded mountains. Who mothered your love of death?" And so in this poem, you do seem to be called to duty. And as you said, you were inspired to write it after the Charlottesville, Unite the Right rally. And you link it to patriotism, as you do also in The Absurd Man is subject to pareidolia. And the last line of that poem is the last poem you read, is "I know I'll suffer this plague forever." And could you describe the link between patriotism and plague a bit?
I laugh. You didn't hear me, but I laughed when you asked the question, even though I knew it was coming. Mainly because there is patriotism itself can be an ideology that blinds us to the humanity of others, and I think the waves of nationalism that has swept Europe, that we are experiencing here in the U.S., mostly around immigration, is itself its own kind of shackle. Who gets to even claim to be a patriot in this country is a question. Or, as you know, being a longtime resident like me recently, who gets to be a Vermonter, for example. Mm-hmm. But that particular poem and the poems that I have been called to write, and I'm using that word "called" intentionally, just to underscore the issue of chore, and to some extent, the plague is I'm actually perplexed by the ideology of white supremacy and how that connects to January 6th, how that connects to January 6th, the march on the U.S. Capitol. I'm perplexed at what allows someone to go and shoot up members in a church, or in the name of a state to kill someone without any sense of emotional kind of connection to the person whose knee is on. So all of that is leading me to kind of write poems that are a little bit louder than what I previously wrote. And to go directly to your question about patriotism and plague, I think to some extent in this country we have to think about what is at core of our identities as Americans, and look at the history of that. We're doing that. We're starting to do it, but we also know to be accountable to that is really difficult. And maybe I should reference or not reference the other headline news at University of Vermont. When we set out to be anti-racist in our practices as teachers and artists, scholars, we are being accountable to a history that all of us are invested in. And that makes me want to be part of the community. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to create space for people to claim beingness. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to you unless I see,
There is a question and several questions in the Q&A. Yeah.
Is there? Okay, good. Let's head there then. I don't like to frustrate people who've been waiting patiently. Charles-Louis, could you read us a question, please?
Yes, so there are a few questions. Like a question from Anonymous, unfortunately. This person said that the forum is very interesting, especially the idea of the importance of seeing the world as it is. And the question that comes out of it is, isn't this almost intolerable given the suffering that is always going on somewhere? And I'm thinking maybe Rob then Major could elaborate on this question.
Well, it is intolerable. It's something that I can't do. Those who could do it, I think of Simone Weil. I also think of her very short life, that it was a life that was so deeply invested in attending to others that it seemed that it was a life that could not last very long. It's the hardest of tasks, says Iris Murdoch wrote. And I don't think unlike they, I don't think that either Murdoch or Camus insisted that we somehow achieve this absolute purity of vision, a vision of what Murdoch goes on to argue as a Platonist is the notion of good, the idea of good. But it's the striving to achieve this, this fully embodied attention to others, simply being aware of others. or being aware of all of the ruses, all the strategies we employ. In order not to be aware, I know that every time, and I know this may sound silly, but it's not, I believe. Every time I pull up to a stoplight in Houston, there's somebody at the corner asking for help, asking for money. And I cannot begin to count the number of strategies I have not to lower my window. I found myself in the position of the characters, apart from Joseph Grand, in The Plague, that I am not yet paying attention. What I'm paying attention to is my own discomfort. And I think that is at least a first step to lowering the window and keeping it down time and time again. But it's always a work in progress. I wish I had a better answer, a more concise answer for Anonymous, but I don't. But I do believe that the importance for Camus and for Murdoch, if not for Simone Weil, who was just relentless in her demands upon herself and upon others, that the goal for Camus and for Murdoch is that, well, this is something that we should always work towards. But of course, it's the tragic condition of our lives that we'll never actually get there.
Thank you, Major. Can you have comments about the question or what Rob just discussed?
Well, I'm curious about what I wonder if it'll help Rob, because I so appreciate that moment where Camus, your interpretation of Camus, is the moral imperative to look, to keep the window down. And what a great example. I sense a poem emerging from that example. But yes, the suffering is there, and it's illogical. It's, to use Camus' word, absurd. But in the face of it, there is the imperative to look, but also to kind of live through it. And I hear this, particularly during this moment we find ourselves in with this global pandemic. It is hard to ignore. I hope we're not ignoring the suffering and the pain that others are experiencing from whatever privileged provinces we inhabit. The necessity is, and maybe Rob can speak to this, the end of the plague finds the doctor urging us not to celebrate too soon. To ever be mindful that there are plagues of, at least in how I interpret, there are plagues of many kinds that threaten our existence.
And there is a wonderful question that will allow us to piggyback on what you just said. And actually, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it, Major. And I think then that Rob and Meaghan should also answer this question. This is a question and comment by Alice Flinta, who wants to thank the three of you for the wonderful discussion and the fantastic poetry readings. And I think it's a discussion that goes really straight to what was at the core of your presentations today. So we live in a time of social media and immediate media output through radio, TV, social media. So we have the ability to know in real time what goes on around the world. To a certain extent, everybody becomes a reporter by by the mean of social media. So the question that I would like you to think about, Major, and then we can go to our two other presenters, was whether this time of ultra connectivity changes our responsibilities with regard to the seeing, speaking, acting. Are we more responsible? Should we be? Are we more conflicted? And are we, or is the world more absurd in some way because of this connectivity?
I think Camus would say the world is more absurd. Famously in Create Dangerously, he talks about the public or the masses, the pressures of the masses on the artist, particularly to kind of write their reality or speak to their needs, and the independence of thought and the independence of imagination that the artist and the writer has to almost, in this particular age, that independence has to be so severely preserved. One's vision, artistic vision, one's art can be, in this day and age, quickly canceled or critiqued from all corners of the world. And I think in this particular climate, this hyper connectivity, as the interlocutor puts it, renders artists a little bit more self-conscious, I think. And that I find to be an absurd kind of position, because artists thrive on solitude and could we call it the democratization of criticism? I don't know, but everyone has a voice, and that's okay. I'm not disagreeing with that, but for the artist, it can be a pretty shaky ground by which to write and create.
Thank you, Major. Rob?
It's a tough one. I know Meaghan has a better answer than I have. I don't know if absurdity waxes and wanes over time. I suspect there's a finite amount of absurdity, only insofar as Camus takes pains to underscore in the myth of Sisyphus that absurdity is not something out there. Absurdity is the convergence of two different factors. On the one hand, there is us, human beings, who are plagued with this need for meaning. We always insist upon meaning in our lives. That's what makes us human beings. But we find ourselves living in a cosmos that doesn't reply, it doesn't respond to this need. We seek meaning, and we are met with what he calls in The Stranger, the tender indifference of the skies. At times, the not so tender indifference. And I'm not sure I understand what I am about to say, but perhaps somebody else can make better sense of it. In this notion of the internet age, of interconnectivity, of all of these social platforms that the questioner was wondering about, I wonder if in some sense we are no longer looking to a transcendental realm for answers. Camus denies us that option. There is nothing transcendental that's going to answer our questions. But it seems that we now go to the computer, we go to the web as a source for these answers, as a source of meaning, that we've somehow confounded what we're doing right now on MS Teams as a kind of ersatz transcendence. And I find that is really dangerous. And I'll stop babbling there. Meaghan, save me. Pull me out.
You're doing quite well on your own, and both you and Major. All I'd like to add is something that I develop in my book, and that I find to be very true in any age. It's the notion that Camus had called, you know, les solitaires solidaires, which is the solitary one who experiences solidarity. And that we all are very much alone in this world, no matter the number of, you know, screens we have open and the amount of stimuli we have. And so the importance of being solitaire is being independent and remaining autonomous, and being thinking people who act according to their conscience, and who enter into relationships based on that human bond that we all share with one another. And I believe that that is what Camus would say to us today. And I don't believe that it's any more absurd today than it was back in the 1940s after a genocide, soon before 2 atomic bombs were dropped. For Camus, it was the end of civilization, and let us hope that we never get there. I know that we have to draw this to a close. I want to thank both you, Major, and Rob. I want to thank Charles-Louis for doing a wonderful job, as well as our members of the audience, UVM's Humanities Center, my Department of Romance, Languages, and Cultures, with all the support I get there, University Event Services, Patty, you've been wonderful, the College of Arts and Sciences IT department. I just want to thank everybody for making this event happen. Please keep reading. These authors have something to say to us. And as Major said in one of his poems, that you can't forget when you are a writer, the reader, that there is a relationship there. And so seek those relationships. That's my last word to you. Thank you very much.